Welcome to my lesson on the SVG path element, an intro to Bezier curve commands and animation. Today we'll learn about quadratic and cubic Bezier curves and demystify the D attribute. We'll end up by animating the D attribute of this curve. And what we learn today will build the foundation for more complex animations that we'll tackle in the future. We left off last time talking about polygons that have a points attribute, which is basically a string of the XY values of all of these different points that make up the polygon. I can move any of these points anywhere I want, but the point here, is that with all the line methods we've been using so far, we get these very angular drawings, okay? Today we're going to be drawing curved paths. So let me just go ahead and select this and delete it. And over in my spline tool options, you'll see here we have an option to draw with a quadratic Bezier tool. So let me just close the panel and I'm going to click and then move my mouse around and you'll see I get this red line with a little dot in the middle. If I click and hold down and move, that little dot is referred to as a control point. A quadratic Bezier has 3 points: the start point, the end point, and the control point. And as I'm moving my mouse around, you'll see that the control point is moving. Now I'm going to release the mouse and it's going to want me to draw another point. And I can click and I can drag and I can draw this curvy shape. Now right now it has a fill which looks a little bit odd, so let me just hit escape to stop drawing. And I'm going to go to the fill and select none. All right, so now I just have the stroke and we can study it a little bit better and it'll be a little less distracting. Now, if we look down here in the SVG output, you'll see we have a path that has a D attribute. And this D attribute has letters and numbers describing this crazy path that I just drew. And all of these points along the path, let me use my edit tool, I'm just going to select one of them, has their own control points, all right? So after the path is drawn, I can use these handles to change around the curvature of those arcs. And as I'm moving the handles, if you look in the SVG output, you'll see that a bunch of numbers are changing, okay? So every little change that I make gets reflected in the SVG output here. Now you may be saying, Carl, what do all these letters mean? Capital M, capital C, and then all these strings of numbers. Well, don't worry, it gets much more confusing than that. Let's head on over to the MDN web docs for the D attribute. And it says the D attribute defines a path to be drawn. And here we have an example of how a heart would be drawn. And you'll see there's commands like capital M, capital A, Q, and what do all those mean? Well, this page is loaded with information that I assure you somebody much smarter than me could teach an entire course on. Here's a helpful overview of the categories of path commands that we have, and we're really going to be concerned mainly with the capital M and capital C today. So M means that we're moving the pen somewhere, and C means that we're going to be adding control points for a cubic Bezier curve. And as we scroll down the page, you'll see all this described in much more technical jargon. Now, whenever we see a capital letter, it means an absolute value, and lowercase means that it's going to be relative to the current position of the pen. And you can read more about that here. Maybe we'll do some experiments later on, but I just want to urge you to get familiar with the documents here. They're very helpful, but it takes a while to really understand what all these things mean, and quite honestly, I know about 10% of it, so don't get worried. We're going to start slow and get through this. And before we get out of here, I just want to focus on the cubic Bezier curve, which are smooth curve definitions using 4 points. So you have your starting point, your end point, your start control point, and your end control point. Don't worry at all about this cryptic stuff right here. What we're going to be focused on is just this uppercase C, which is going to allow us to provide the X and Y coordinates of the beginning and end control points. To make this all make sense, let's jump back into Boxy SVG and work with a simpler path. So I'll get rid of this one, and I'm going to first go to View and turn on the grid, which will make it easier to visualize the coordinates. To modify the grid, I can grab this square and move it around, or go to the Geometry panel, and I'm just going to input 50 by 50. Let me close the panel, And then let's go back to the spline tool, and what I want to do is select the cubic Bezier tool, close the panel, and let's just go over 100 pixels, down 100. I'm going to click, and then as I drag, you'll see I have this red line. Let me go over from 100 to 200, 300, 400, and basically click right here and pull down. And you'll see that this end control point shows up. And when I release, we have a path with the D attribute. Let's go ahead and just hit escape real quick to quit drawing that path. And I want to show you that there's also a beginning control point, but the problem is that it's literally in the same point as the start point. It's kind of hard to drag and see. But if I take this curve and just sort of modify it, you'll see it show up, okay? So I'm going to take this first control point and just move it up to an X of 100 and a Y of 50. And for the second control, or the ending control point, let's put that at an X of 400 and a Y of 50. So now that we have this clean curve built, let's investigate this D attribute. And to make this D attribute easier to understand, I'm going to go ahead and double click here, and I'm going to then copy out that string. I'm going to select the text tool, and then I'm just going to click and paste it in so that it's a little bit easier on our eyes, okay? Next what I'm going to do is use my edit tool, and I'm going to select the first point in our curve and then shift click on the second one. That's going to give us both control points visible. Now let's go through this command. M means we're going to move our virtual pen to this position. So that's over 100 and down 101 for the first point. I really wish I made that an even 100. Next, the C command says we're going to do a cubic Bezier using 150 for the first control point. So that's an X of 100 and a Y of 50. And that gives us this point right here. Then we have another control point at X of 400, Y of 50. And so that's all the way over here. And then our last point is the end point, which is an X of 400 and a Y of 99. So take some time to study that if you need to, but we'll be moving on. And one thing I want to point out before getting into animation is that I've shown you that we can move these control points independently, but also if I grab this curve and move it around, notice that to render that curve, both control points need to move, and you'll see them updating in the Elements panel below. Let's get on to building our first animation. I'm going to get rid of that simple line, and let me just go back to the spline tool. Let me just click here. I'm going to move over to here and click and drag to get that handle to show up. Release, and then click again right here. I'm going to hit escape to close that off, and then maybe use the edit tool to take this center point and just adjust those handles a little bit. So now I have this really nice curve. Let me just go into the fill tool and remove the fill, so all I have is the stroke. Now let's do some animation on this. The first step is I'm going to select the SVG down here and do copy outer SVG. Over in this code pen, I'm just going to paste the SVG into the HTML. Ooh, that looks nice. I can give the SVG a class of demo so that that outer stroke shows up as a border. And you may notice that this defs node showed up, and it has information for how Boxy SVG was rendering the grid. That's really not important to us here because it's not something we're going to see. So I'm just going to get rid of that. And then let's switch back to Boxy. I'm going to select that path again, and I'm just going to take this center node here, and let's adjust the control points and just flip it around to be something like this. I'm now going to take that D attribute that has all the drawing commands that I need for that path. I'm going to copy it out, jump back into CodePen, and all I got to do is add a little .toTween here. I'll just select the path for now, and we'll do an attribute tween, and the attribute we're going to use is the D attribute. Let me just paste in that path value. Ooh, that was cool. We can run that again. And of course, with GSDev tools, you can do a little slow-mo scrubby scrub. Now, I know this doesn't look beautiful, but you have the ability to style these things however you want. I'm going to get rid of this inline style up here just to get rid of it. And using some of the things we learned in other lessons, I'm just going to boom, paste in some more CSS. And there we have a pretty pink line, all right? Look at how much that elevates it. Looking pretty good. So of course, you can design things how you want in your art programs or restyle them using CSS. And pretty much all I did was I gave the SVG a background color, and then I redefined the path so that it would have fill none, stroke width 4, and the stroke color of that pink color. And I know this bendy line may not be the most thrilling animation you've ever seen, but the techniques we learned today we'll use down the road building more expressive animations like this ball bouncing on the wire. This actually isn't too hard of an animation as far as bending the wire goes, but it gets a little bit tricky when we try to get the exact easing and timing that's going on here. But don't worry, we'll tackle that in a lesson in the near future. This week for your homework, I'm going to encourage you to go back into Boxy SVG and just use, the spline tool, get familiar with it, draw your own shapes, have some fun. You can even do a closed shape. Let me just do this real quick and we can close it off. And once it's drawn, use the edit tool. You can make like a crazy blob if you want. Definitely have some fun with it. And remember, just copy the SVG out, and then when you build your animation, what you're going to do is animate this path to something else. And you can just select all the points that you drew, do some slight modifications, and then you can animate between those two states exactly as I did with my simpler path. As long as your starting path and end path have the same number of points, you should be good to go. And in another future lesson, I'm going to teach you about GreenSock's Morph SVG plugin, which allows us to morph paths with any number of points. It's going to automatically generate the points we need between the start and ending shapes, and you can do pretty much anything you can imagine. But for now, you got to get familiar with the basics. So do your homework, build a fun path animation, and read up on those D attribute docs. There's a lot in there, and you don't have to memorize it all, but it's good to have familiarity. See you in the next lesson. Do you want to gain mastery of the GreenSock animation platform through more videos like this? I'll show you all the tips and tricks I've learned over a decade of using GSAP, working at GreenSock, and teaching it to thousands of developers like you. My training is guaranteed to save you hours of frustration as you learn to add ultra-slick animations to all your web projects. From UI animations to text effects to just plain silly stuff, CreativeCodingClub.com has you covered. Join today to get early access to my groundbreaking SVG Animation with GreenSock course, plus over 180 GSAP lessons, and get new lessons weekly. Visit CreativeCodingClub.com for more details.